Okay. Did she struggle at all?
I don't think so, but I was blocking her face and my hand was right here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You had one hand here and one hand over her mouth.
And were you just pushing her against the back of the seat type thing? Okay. What was Bella doing?
She was sitting there next to it. She didn't know what was going on.
Okay. Could she see you? Okay. And then went down to Bella. Tell me what happened there.
She said, what happened to Cece? First she asked if it was the same thing, the exact same thing that happened to me as Cece.
Did she ask you that? Okay. So Bella's pretty smart. How did she sound when she asked you that, Chris?
She had that soft voice she always had.
Yeah. And what exactly did she say?
She said exactly the same thing that happened to me as Cece. And then I said, I don't even remember what I said.
Okay.
I don't know if I just said yes like a horrible person, or if I just put that blanket over her too and did the same thing.
Same blanket, same way?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
She said, no, Daddy. And that's the next thing she said.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Let's have a show of hands. How many of you believe that the watched children were killed at the well site? Don't be shy, put up your hands. It should be most of you because that is the official narrative, the official version from the media, from law enforcement, and from, I think, the majority of people, of the YouTube creators, so social media as well. The consensus is that that is where it happened. And so in this sense, True Crime Rocket Science is absolutely in the minority. And fairly recently, I think December 7th, we heard from CBI agent Tammy Lee why law enforcement believed the second confession. And her answer was, if the second version is more horrible, it must be true. Makes sense, doesn't it? Sometimes things that make sense aren't true, however. In this episode, I'm going to take you through the thought process of True Crime Rocket Science. And I hope it's going to challenge you. You don't have to agree with it, but I'm going to pose 3 questions. And I'm going to show you how I answer them. But essentially what I want to do is, when you go into the Lifetime movie, I want you to have these same 3 questions in your mind, and I want you to consider them while you're watching this movie, because what's going to happen in this film is this version that you believe is going to be dramatized. This version that makes sense to you, you're going to actually see it dramatized. And my question to you is, before we actually see it dramatized, is, do you think it's going to make sense? Do you think the dramatization is going to be credible or reasonable or reliable or believable based on what we know? And so I'm kind of asking you to open your mind and to think objectively about what you're about to see. That's really what this video is all about. The thing that kind of got me started on this particular topic was an article in, I think it's MEAW, the website MEAWW, I think. Chris Watts' neighbor knew he was guilty when he showed little interest in crucial surveillance videos. This is just part of the sort of the drumming up of publicity prior to the Lifetime film. I'm actually not sure if this was. Oh, okay. So I've just confirmed this is actually publicity for Chris Watts' Colorado Killer Dad, The Friends Speak. So which is also premiering on Reels on January 25th. But regardless, the question that sort of comes up in this particular article is sort of how you had kind of a next door neighbor based on very little evidence. He basically just noticed Chris Watts turning his back on his television, and from that kind of realized this guy looks like he's guilty. And he was right. That was, it turned out, an astute assessment, and the district attorney, I think, in this documentary says that. And I'm asking you to try and provide or try and use the same kind of logic, but in terms of something else. And that something else sort of comes up a little bit later in the article, where the journalist or whoever wrote this article kind of very matter-of-factly kind of says their children were still alive at the time. Watts would take them along on a trip to an oil site where he buried his pregnant wife in a shallow grave. I'm going to start the basically this thought experiment by just asking you, do you think it makes more sense to, in a premeditated murder, do you think it makes more sense to do it out in the open, sort of where you're driving to a location where other people are also driving to? It's not like you're going to it's a remote location, but it's also a location where there are other people. They are also on their way there. And ultimately, Watts did meet other people at Survey 319. So would you go sort of out in the open to a relatively uncontrolled environment, and bear in mind the sun is rising, or would you do it in your own home? Would you sort of do it within the walls of your own home? What would you do? And bear in mind, there's no evidence either way. There's sort of no evidence at Survey 319 or inside the truck that we know of that the crime was committed there. And there's also negligible information that the crime was in the home, although the dogs did seem to alert. But let's just forget about that. If you were planning this crime, which venue would make the most sense? And so the three questions I'm going to address are: could Bella see what was happening to Cece? So the agent asks Chris Watts this question, and you don't really hear his answer. Another question that's asked, I haven't mentioned it here, but it sort of forms part of that, is did Cece struggle at all? And you also don't really hear a very convincing answer from Chris Watts. You can play it back, but the agent says, in terms of Cece, did she struggle at all? And if you pay attention to what's said right at the beginning of this episode, right, the clip right in the beginning, Watts doesn't sound very sure of himself. He sort of says, I don't think so. Surely you would know. Surely you would know if there was a struggle. Surely there would be a sense of conviction and certainty. And then number two, and for this, you've got to sort of just listen to the agent. You've got to listen to the tone of his voice. It also helps to have paid attention to Coda throughout the many interrogations, which I think many of you have. But does it sound like the agent believes Chris Watts when he says certain things? Because sometimes he says, oh, and sometimes he says, okay. And there's a kind of an intonation. And at certain times that intonation changes a little bit. And then number three, do you agree that Cece didn't struggle at all? Do you agree with that? Do you think that that's true? Now, before we deal with this in more detail, I'm going to put an idea in your mind, and it's the following. If your reasoning is that if the second version is more horrible, it must be true, then by the same reasoning, you could say, well, if the third version is more horrible than the second, then that must be true. Or if any successive version is more horrible, then that must be true. And that is a ridiculous way to reason, because how you decide if something's true is if the evidence supports it, and if it is if the version that is given matches the circumstances, the timing, the evidence of the case. So to say that if a second version is more horrible doesn't seem to be anchored at all in evidence. So I think you've got to anchor something in evidence and say, well, the evidence shows that and that and that. Because if you take this literally, you could kind of go to court in a murder trial, and the prosecution could simply offer a version that's worse than what actually happened, and the judge would say, you know what, the version you've given me is actually worse, so it must be true. It just is a little bit nonsensical. I know what we're talking about here is a confession, but it's the same thing. If your second version is more horrible, you could say it has more truth, but what if there's a third version or a fourth that's even more horrible? Do you see what I'm getting at? And True Crime Rocket Science does have an explanation for a version that is more horrible than that. So the question that we really want to ask here is, does this version make sense? Does it make sense that Chris Watts would make a crime scene his work vehicle? Potentially he could lose his job if he committed the crime at the work site and somebody saw him, he could lose his job. Now you could argue, well, burying the bodies there, he could lose his job as well, and he ultimately did. But if you have the choice between committing the crime at home compared to committing the crime at the worksite and disposing at the worksite, which one is more risky? We can sort of speculate till the cows come home. We can sort of say this or that, and you can sort of go around in circles and never get anywhere. And I don't want to do that. There's a much smarter way of dealing with all of these questions, and it's through true crime intertextuality. And what that is you take a similar case and you test what happened in that case, and you say, how does that reflect back on our case? So in other words, you're trying to find some information about your case, and so you go to another case, and through that case you see how your case is either similar or different. And so in this particular case, we're going to a Phoenix mother who smothered her 3 children. So it's a mother who killed her children, not the father. And this is a mother who was suffering from drug addiction, and she also confessed to what she did. What we can immediately see in this version is that, first of all, it's a crime that was committed at home. Second of all, it's a crime where 3 children are killed, whereas in the Watts case it was 2 and an unborn child. And there was no adult that was also killed in the scenario. So it was 3 children rather than 2 children, an adult and the unborn child, right? So this mother's name is Rachel Henry, and Rachel was a 22-year-old mother, so quite a young mother, and her one child was about to turn 2 years old the following week. And the following information was provided to, I think, azfamily.com. And so the first child that was killed was the almost 2-year-old child, Maria. So it was first Maria, then it was the 3-year-old Zane, then the older child, and then finally a 6-month-old daughter, Catalea. So the first child was almost 2-year-old. It was a 23-month-old. Then the 3-year-old, the slightly older child, and then the 6-month-old. So when we go through the police report of what happened to her 1-year-old daughter, it refers to, and I know they refer to her being 1 year old, but she's actually just under 2 years old. It refers to Maria kicking at her. So this is just a 2-year-old child, right? But still having the capacity to defend herself, to fight for her life. And so she was kicking, and while this was happening, her 3-year-old son Zane was yelling at her, trying to get her to stop, right? And also punching her to no avail, according to the report. When the mother went after her son, she had to chase him. She was trying to catch him, and obviously this 3-year-old boy anticipated what was about to happen to him, so he ran away. He tried to evade her, and then, amazingly enough, a person arrived at the residence, even played with the little boy, and then left. And then after he'd left, the mother did what she meant to do anyway. And when she did this, her son scratched her chest and pinched her while his mother did what she did to him. So you had both children literally fighting back quite vigorously and desperately. Now, when we go to the official version, the Chris Watts case, you actually have a situation that's quite different. You have a situation where the children's mother is with them in a very enclosed space, and they know that she's there. They know that, this is according to the official version, that they know that Shanann is with them in the truck and that she's not moving. And they don't show any concern. They don't show any. They're basically not distressed. They're also not in their car seats, and they're not distressed about that either. And Chris Watts is able to drive for a really long way, around about 45 minutes or so, and the children are just completely not distressed. And that lack of distress continues when Shanann is removed from the truck. There's still no distress. Then, according to Chris Watts, I don't believe this is true, but according to Chris Watts, he then strangles Cece, and Bella is sitting right next to her, and Bella doesn't say anything. It's not really acknowledged, but Bella also doesn't do anything. There's just no response. Now you should compare, and Bella's a 4-year-old. You should compare this to what the 3-year-old did in response to what was happening to his 2-year-old sister, right? Punching, yelling, and so on. And then when it was his turn, he was also pinching and kicking, right? In this instance with Chris Watts, Cece doesn't do anything. Bella, sitting right next to her, doesn't do anything to defend her sister or even object. She doesn't even say anything. There's not even a word spoken. There's simply no response. And then Chris Watts says he doesn't even know how long it took. He can't say how long this took. I can tell you, it wouldn't have taken less than about 3 minutes. 3 minutes is a very long time for a child to sit still next to another child going through that kind of thing. You might object to that and say, no, maybe it was quicker. Even if it was 30 seconds, it's a very long time for one child to sit still while the child right next to that child is in distress. And if what I'm saying to you is distressing you, it shouldn't, because this is a fictional scenario. I don't think it even happened. So being distressed about something that didn't happen is stupid. It's crazy. But this is the version that everyone wants to believe. And you've got to look at the actual words that Chris uses. And what he says is, Bella asked him, this is when he gets back into the truck. So in his version, both children are alive. He strangles the one, takes her to the oil tank, puts her in, and then when he returns, Bella says, well, what happened to Cece? And then he corrects himself, because Bella knows what happened to Cece in terms of her sitting right next to her. But now the question is the same thing going to happen to me as Cece? In other words, are you also going to put me in the oil tank? But this is the part that I think everybody misses. Do you really think that Bella would ask him in a soft voice, just ask him a simple question? And this is how Chris Watts puts it, is that she asks him with her voice low. And then even after that, when Chris Watts talks about Bella's last words, he says, Bella said, Daddy, no. Said, not shouted, not screamed, not yelled. And there's no struggling here either. It's just, she said, Daddy, no. And then the interrogators have sort of got to ask him, well, okay, in terms of injuries, what happened? And then he says, well, he thought that she grunted and he felt something under, but only when he's prompted. It's almost like he's got to remember this. But the point is, Bella never screams during this life and death struggle, and Bella is anticipating it. She knows that what's happened to Cece. So she knows what's going to happen to her, and yet she says something. She doesn't shout it. She's not screaming. She's not terrified. She says something. And Chris Watts repeatedly uses the word said and spoke. The only thing that he gets wrong is he gets the order wrong. Sometimes he says, Daddy, no. Other times he says, no, Daddy. And you're only going to pick that up when you really pay attention to the transcript. And that's another major problem with this version, is that Chris Watts can't even get the order of words right. Now, you might not think that's a very strong case. You might say, look, maybe Bella did say something very loudly or whatever. And you might also say, how could there possibly be a version that's worse than this? Well, there is an answer to it. There is a version that's worse than this. But the reason the media, I don't personally believe law enforcement do believe Chris Watts. I think they just want this case to settle down. They want to wash their hands off it. So I think they don't want to resuscitate it a third time or a fourth time. So they're happy just to sort of let people think whatever they are and kind of go along with it. That does seem to be the vibe. That they're trying to let the case settle down. And so it feels like an appeal to ignorance. And if you look at the illustration, you see two, I think they're rabbits, and they're looking at something in the sky, and they say, well, there's a strange beam of light. It must mean that we're not alone in the universe, that thing that we're not quite sure what it could be. And that kind of is how the human mind works. When we see something that we're not quite sure what it is, we tend to think and expect that it's something significant rather than something that's not significant. So, for example, the shadow that we saw in the driveway, we expect it to be something significant because we know what the end result is. When we see someone stepping out and they're wearing different shoes, we want it to mean something significant, because the alternative is it's boring. There's nothing here, folks. Let's move on. It's the same basic psychology when you get a message on your phone, a notification. You think it could be, you might be waiting for important news. And then when a notification comes through, you think it could be an answer. It could be this important news you're waiting for. But all it is some absolutely arbitrary notification that someone liked a picture of a flower you put up, or something completely arbitrary. And that does tend to be how life is most of the time. It tends to be arbitrary 99 times out of 100. And we are only really surprised by something that is worse or better than we expected 1% or less than 1% of the time. During my coverage of this case from the very beginning, through the course of that, I put up a lot of articles just examining this whole question. From there's a reason Chris Watts can't remember Bella's last words, to the talk that Watts supposedly had with Shanann. People who believe that Watts talked with Shanann I don't think have any idea what the dynamics were in that marriage, what is actually going on. Watts thinks that you think that he was a guy just like anyone else who, if there was a problem, he would talk to his wife about it. Except that's not the case, and that is why the murder happened, because he couldn't talk to his wife about it. He felt that he couldn't do that. Way back when, Scott Reich basically, and this was based around this whole question of the crime happening at the well site. Scott Reich, a well-known defense lawyer, said, I don't think Shanann's murder was premeditated. And he said this on March the 23rd, which was just after the second confession. And a lot of people said the same about the children. Just the randomness and spontaneity of it was that they didn't think it was premeditated. But after the third confession, where Chris Watts said he'd been thinking about it for weeks, now it is premeditated. How do you reconcile premeditation with something as crazy as taking your children a long way from home to this work site? And what if someone was actually there? What if people were actually there? How are you going to explain why you've got children in your car? And then there's also the question of Bella's last words suggest that the Watts children weren't smothered at the well site. So I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts on this question. I could do a really long episode just dealing with this particular question, but I'm not going to deal with it in a lot of detail. But I did say earlier, what if there is a version that's worse than this? Right? And you might say, well, what could possibly be worse than this? And for you, and for the public and for society, you might say, well, I think it's impossible that there could be a version worse than this. But you're seeing it from the wrong perspective. It is, what if there's a version for Chris Watts that's worse than this? In other words, what if there's a version that reflects really, really badly on him personally? Not so much on the victims, but on his state of mind, his motivations, his behavior. That is a lot worse than what actually happened. And you might say, there's absolutely no way that that's possible. But there are many ways that that's possible. And one of the most simple is, you could say, what if Chris Watts killed his children on Sunday night, early on Sunday night, for no better reason than he wanted that time to talk to his mistress? In other words, he was impatient to get back to his mistress. He didn't want to wait till the next day to commit the crime. And so what he did was, he did what he did sooner than later, because what he really wanted to was talk to Nicole Kessinger that night. What if that is the actual scenario? You might say, how's that worse than the actual version? Well, I think if you're Chris Watts, it's a lot worse, because your motive for killing your children is that you just want to chat over the phone with your mistress without being disturbed. It's a lot worse. Also reflects, in a way, badly on Nicole Kessinger. It puts her kind of in the middle of it. The other reason to say that Chris Watts said what he said is he didn't volunteer his version. He was kind of led down the garden path to give that version. And so if you presented with a version where you're chronologically going through something that you did step by step, you kind of want to avoid dealing with what you've got to deal with. And so if there's a situation where that suggests that the children were alive when they weren't, but maybe there's some evidence that the children may have been alive, aren't you going to take it? And so that's a version that is less horrible, actually, for Chris Watts. It's a version where he didn't kill the children at the first possible opportunity. He killed them almost as an afterthought. He didn't know what he was doing. He was out of his mind. So from his perspective, it's a less horrible version. But he's nevertheless saying what he thinks people want to hear. And that is what people want to hear, just in the same way that the shadows are what people want to see. I don't expect a lot of people to go along with this. I don't expect a lot of people to accept this, because most people don't. Law enforcement officially doesn't, and the media officially doesn't. So obviously with all of that, I don't expect logic to prevail. I just think it is quite crazy that you have all sorts of people getting hysterical about what a terrible thing that happened, and they're getting hysterical. My personal feeling is, more than a year after this case, it's just shocking how much information is out there and how little most people know about this case. And I thought I was not controlling the narrative, but certainly influencing the narrative early on by writing about it, analyzing it, blogging about it. And I'm impressed by the power of the media and the power of these documentaries and just experts all over the place to say things that are actually just don't make any sense. I'm really impressed by the ability of just, the media and so on, despite all the effort that I've certainly put into it. And you might say, well, you're wrong. Maybe I am wrong. But I'm really impressed by how the amount of information I've put out, the amount of books I've put out, and yet you still have so many people who believe differently. And that's kind of worrying. You look at the impeachment trial and you see how you have partisanship there. And you see that truth isn't so much about logic and intelligence. It seems to be about what you want to believe. Not what is true, but what you want to believe and whose side you're going to be on. And that makes for a very dangerous world that we live in. What happens when you have a partner or a friend and you suspect them about something, or there's some issue with them, and you hear two rumors about them, and then you say, well, if the second version is more horrible, it must be true. What does that say about you? What does that say about your attitude to veracity? If you take the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and you say, there can't be a worse version than that. There must be weapons of mass destruction because it's a horrible thought. Well, there's also another possibility, which is actually in a way more horrible, that you go to war in a country and there are no weapons of mass destruction. That's actually more horrible. But people preferred the idea that there were weapons of mass destruction, right? That's kind of the psychology that we're dealing with. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. I'd also be very interested to hear your answers to these three questions. And I'd be very interested to hear, if you watch the film, whether you thought about these questions in a different way while you were watching it or afterwards. please let me know. Will you? Will you let me know if you do watch the film, what your thoughts are on some of these issues? Okay, and that's it. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the content of this channel,